Hello, welcome to the meeting tent, our program discussing the work of Stan Tenen, the Meru Foundation. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our usual cast of characters: Levana Tenen, Daniel Gill, Adele Packer, and Michael Andron. So today we're going to continue the path that we've chosen for the last few episodes in going to extremekabbalah.org. In which there are 33 snippets of videos taken from Stan's earlier presentations. They're short, some are 30 seconds, some 2 minutes. And so we've, as in previous programs, we've each chosen a topic and then discuss it. And the last 2 episodes, they came out pretty good. I mean, the discussion went in a lot of different directions, but it was a good base in which to start. So let's get started, because I know this is going to take up a lot of time. And let's start with you, Michael.
Hebrew flame letters.
This entirely asymmetrical object, which in the past we've identified as a flame of consciousness. Hebrew letters are said to come from flame. Arabic letters are said to come from flame. Shadows of this object are all of these Hebrew letters. Same one object generates all of these letters of the alphabet.
What does the tradition say about the Hebrew letters being flame letters? Where does that come from?
Well, there is an idea that of calling the letters black fire on white fire, that the Torah and the letters are moving around until that was the Torah that God looked into when he created the world. So that flame idea indicates something from out there. I mean, we think of, the hot sun and the water world, and the two, the Aish and the Mayim, the fire and the water, are sort of like two ends of a battery, and they connect, and that becomes a connective system. So even when we say, we don't say the 4-letter name of God, we say Hashem, the name, but you could just as easily be saying the Shin Mem. The Shin Mem is your network. If you're not online, then you can't you can't talk to each other on Zoom. You can't log into the website and look at something because you're not online. So there's the positive and the negative, the one that gives and the one that receives, except unlike physical flame and physical water, one doesn't put the other one out. And what you really are, because you can't have flame without oxygen. If you just take, physical flame, you need oxygen to feed it so that it can radiate outward. And water being H2O, you begin to have some sense of this is a primordial water. It's a source. Like a well. And that's our world. We're mostly water. Our bodies are mostly water. Our planet is mostly water. We're down here. And if God wants to communicate from out there, then there's that influx that comes down, but it's a different kind of flame. And so the letters kept moving. They were dancing on, I guess, a less negative note, but there's a reference too that when Rabbi Akiva died, when he was being flailed with the forks and his skin was coming off, I may be mixing up two of the martyrs, but
No, that's right.
I think it was Rabbi Akiva.
It is,
That the letters flew out
right.
and went back to their source.
Mhm.
You know, as he said the Shema and he passed, and it was kind of like the soul went up with the letters.
Mhm.
There's some feel to all of it that that fire is one of the it's like the sun, not the moon.
Mhm.
And so even the sun and the moon, one affects us in one way and the other affects us in the other. And a tree needs both. So if we're going to be, we need the light. I mean, I don't think it means flame. And yet, so many of the letters, particularly in the sort of, it's sort of a Rashi
Yeah.
font
Mhm.
that he used for most of the images. They look like flames.
Now, he was talking about what he looked at the model, this is before he realized it was a hand model, the flame of consciousness. So he was talking about an inner flame when as a model representing an internal flame, I assume that
There was that. To be honest, that particular video was done, I think, in 1991.
That was early.
And that was the first video that was made almost immediately after his discovery that the way to uh, that the model was actually intended to fit on the hand and be a guide towards gestures, and that was, that was essential to understanding the whole system, was that you as the person holding the model, you know, that was the reference point, was yourself. So if you watch more of that particular video, you can see the transition between the ideas which he had presented to that same audience previously, which had to do with its being shadowgrams, and he was trying to find a system of manipulating the model, an algorithm for manipulating the model to get directly from one letter to another all the way through the alphabet, which he could never find until he basically turned the whole thing inside out by putting the observer at the center, the mover at the center, basically putting the model on his hand and demonstrating the letters. So in a way, that little tiny snippet was kind of a transition. He mentally kind of took off on the idea of black fire and white fire. That was where he started to build some internal imagery about that there were an expression of flame and what is flame and so on. But he eventually, I won't say walked away from that necessarily, but his understanding of the model really deepened and expanded when he realized that it was a model hand. If you actually watch that whole early video, which again was the very first time that he presented the idea of the model as a hand model in public, you'll notice that Bill has put a little crawl on the bottom of a couple of a certain sequence of it where he's putting the model on his hand, but that model comes in two-handedness. The curve goes in two different chiralities, two different directions, and it took a while for Stanley to figure out which hand was which. So on this video, if you watch it, when he puts the model on his hand, he's actually putting it on the opposite hand from the one in which it really works.
Because he can see it from his perspective.
No, he was actually, he was still in process of working out the actual gestures at that time. It wasn't until the next presentation that he made, which is the alphabet in our hands, again to the same audience pretty much, where he actually started to demonstrate the sequence of letters wearing models on both of his hands, because by that time, it was a year or two later, he had figured it out.
I have a question on what you're saying, and you guys have been around this so much longer than I. Have you ever, and I don't want to sound frivolous, but have you ever like played a game of charades to see what you can really communicate? You're not using the letters to spell out. It's like that Star Trek episode where the guy talks in metaphors, because there's a whole bigger meaning than just what the letter is or the meaning of the letter. And he's got all those things listed, and the font gets smaller and smaller. As he added other things onto it, have you ever just tried to see how far you can go? If this was an ancient gesturing communicative system, have you ever like said, I have a message, not like, did you flush the toilet kind of thing, but big ideas that you're talking about.
The closest we ever came to it was, there was a certain period of time, Daniel, when we were all living in the same town, and Daniel would come over very frequently, and he and Stanley would experiment with important words from the Siddur or from the Torah itself, to see what the gestures looked like or felt like. But they were starting, from a given word like Baruch, which was a real breakthrough point.
That was amazing. What a great moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
So what you're talking about, Michael, we actually never did, in part because there were never enough people physically present, present who were interested enough to collaborate with us. I mean, Daniel was basically it in terms of local people. And Zoom was not a thing back in the early 90s. So the answer to your question, I guess, is no. And that would be something that might be interesting to do, assuming we get the hand model produced and enough people have it. Something I'm remembering, Michael, some of the things that you've talked about, doing with your family, with your kids growing up. And that might be something to do with a group like that, if everybody
knew it.
There.
Yeah.
But we just never had enough people.
Adele, you had a comment.
At the same time, who were close enough to work together.
Right.
I mean,
no Zoom.
That was basically the movement research that I was doing, was to not only embody all of the letters, just really know them in my body, so that I can spell words. And then as we started to spell words, what did the word mean, and how did the transition from one letter to the other reveal something about the word? And suddenly we were moving more abstractly. We didn't keep our hands cupped once we were
dancing.
In a more expressive interpretation of the concept that we were dancing about. And my solo on Dalit really captured it beautifully, because I took specific words like devukot and da, like know before whom you stand, right? And then to take that, the actual gestures of the words. There are many words spelled in that solo, and to use that to further express what it's like to reach, to reach and connect. So the beauty and depth of Dalit, that I tried to embody, I laugh because it's so deep that I didn't even know what I was stepping into, that how much power there is in simply finding these words that begin with the letter Dalit and string them into a meaningful dance that told a story of 4 doors and 4 ways to connect. So that's, I mean, it's enough material for a lifetime. Pick one letter
Letter.
There's a lifetime of information that can come from the gesturing, whether it's to make a dance or to make a song or to write a blessing or to create a
In
poem.
these,
It's just endless creative material.
Hold on, Michael, because we do need to move on, because we can come back to this, because I want
Okay.
to make sure everybody has time
Yeah,
to
sure.
do this.
Yeah.
So let's go on to the next one, and give me a second. I'm going to choose the God of Abraham.
It seems to me that the idols of an intelligent, educated person in any age are the icons of the culture, are the models used in each and every culture to describe the sacred, whatever is thought to be sacred, even if it's money, which may be our icon. And different cultures, because they have different experiences and different tools and different times and different needs, look to different things in nature to model certain natural qualities of life, of the sacred quality of life, the birth and death cycle. Acorn oak tree, acorn oak tree. And to cite the ones that I put down, but there are many more. The ancient Chinese, according to Moran, are supposed to have set out with their first original set of ideograms, 28 of them, based on 28 mansions of the lunar zodiac, a cyclic system. The Persians and the Greeks used the solar zodiac, and they had gods and goddesses warring with each other as the zodiac went around. And the Druids are into the life cycle of trees and living things and vegetables. All peoples pick something cyclic to represent the cyclic nature of life. There's nothing wrong with any of these models. They are all true. But none of them are universal. Each is specific to its time and culture and to the understanding of its metaphor. And each is limited to the extent that the model is limited. Abraham, in my version, acting as a mathematician, says, I don't need to eat the dough in the donut. All I need to know is the 7-color map. I don't even need the 7-color map. All I need is the outline. Let's strip away all the embodiments. Let's take out the lunar zodiac. Let's take out the solar zodiac. Let's get rid of all the trees. They're all true. But let's, as mathematicians, just look at the unembodied principle underneath all of them. What do they all have in common? Well, they have this quality of naked recursion, naked in the mathematical sense. They represent just the cyclic nature of all things, including the cyclic nature of our consciousness, which reflects back to itself, which is what our thumb is about. And so when you strip away all of these embodiments, you end up without any graven images. You end up with a sequence of feelings, parts of a meditation perhaps, parts of the sense of how life organizes. And that's, by definition, the one God. That is a unity underlying everything. And if it's also a geometric, mathematicians type model of unity, then you can learn certain things about why there is a one God and what the function of that is by examining the model.
So I remember this paper that Stan wrote was called The God of Abraham, and he was discussing the idea of Abraham as a mathematician, Abraham, the patriarch in the Bible. And it builds on the story that we learned in Hebrew school about Abraham, it was Abram at the time. His father was Terach. He was a purveyor of idols. And according to this simple story, he had a shop filled with idols, and Abram was a caretaker in his father's shop. One day, Terach leaves the shop. Abram picks up a stick and he starts smashing all the idols, all for one. He puts the stick in that one idol's hand. Terach comes back and says, "Hey, what has gone on? What happened to who smashed all the idols?" And Abram says, "That one did." And Terach says, "What, are you kidding me? Come on, they're just stones." And Abram says, "Yeah, right." So Stan built on that idea that no, Tarok did not own a shop. He probably was a priest and knew all the different cultures of the world, whatever civilization they lived in. And Abram studied with his father and learned all these different cultures and ideas that were going around at the time that Stan just described. And at some point saw the underlying principle, and that oneness was the underlying principle, and that they all have the cyclic nature, and that's what they had in common, that it was an internal and an external idol or way of looking at things. Well, Stan kind of did the same thing. He'd made this discovery of the pattern, and he spent 10 years researching everything. He talks about it on the tape. Little green men in flying saucers. He was completely indiscriminate in what he looked at. But after 10 years, as he describes it, he discovered that there was something in common, the underlying principle. The same thing that Abram did, and came to the same discovery that Abram did eventually. So that's a very, very powerful message that if people looked into that, you don't have to be a physicist or you don't have to be a mathematician, but if you are, for example, a biblical scholar, or, want to find the source of your faith, this is a story, because now we're looking at it from a mathematical, objective perspective. We're looking at oneness not as a faith, not as a culture, as a geometric principle. And mathematician, as Stan points out, has no prejudice, and is open to everyone. So I really liked that paper. I highly suggest. I think it's on the website, isn't it?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah,
it is.
Meru.org. It's called The God of Abraham. It was one of the first things that Stan wrote that I actually got, and really
And it's a very early paper as well. And actually, just a side note, and I don't have the exact reference on hand. Michael, you probably know it. Just that the idea of being able to logically induce that that there's a unity, that God exists, is there's a reference from Maimonides, the Rambam, that that's one of the paths that he wrote down as to this approach to belief. And I'm sorry I'm so vague about it. If I were at my other computer, I would be typing and bringing it up, but it does exist. Yeah, and this particular video was actually the next video after the first one we saw, the alphabet in our hands. And if you listen to this particular clip, knowing that in between those two clips, he had discovered and started to explore the letter sequences and as gestures. You can sense his understanding of the alphabet as a unitary system, kind of underneath what he's saying. That was interesting for me because I hadn't heard him in this particular phase of his understanding for many years. It's been a long time since I've watched those tapes, and that was a real breakthrough, going from having the model of the letters be external to oneself to having oneself as the reference. I keep coming back to that because I think that was really the most important inversion of an idea that led to everything else that followed.
Yeah, that was a real breakthrough. He had just written that paper and handed it out to the crowd at that presentation. And like I said, I highly recommend people going to the website to check that out. Any other comments on that idea? Otherwise, we can move on. Lavana, do you want to go next, or shall we? I see your.
Oh, I'm still hanging up.
Okay, well, while you're doing that,
never mind. That's
okay. Let's go ahead and why don't you choose
okay. My choice was the letter text of Genesis as creation.
Now, modern physics attempts a bottom-up reconstruction. Take all the diversity we find, all the forces in the world, and pump the energy up until things merge together, and eventually we can extrapolate and find the Big Bang, the one from the many. And I'm saying we can do this abstractly, we can do this topologically in principle, without any electron microscopes and cyclotrons and supercomputers. We can start top-down by definition, start with a singularity, break it up by minimal first distinction, and end up with all there is. And it's my guess, and this is still a guess, that one way or another, in an extraordinarily elegant way, perhaps the most elegant possible, that's what the sequence of letters in the Hebrew Bible really represents.
So here he's taking on the physics world and making some pretty strong claims. But it'd be interesting if people really listen to that and follow that path.
Again, this was in 1999. It was the last really major public lecture that he gave. Again, they were all mostly to the same audience.
This was San Francisco.
San Francisco, Bay Area, people who were interested in that sort of stuff. And so if you watch the Squaring the Circle video, yes, he does review everything in the beginning, but if you take a look at those whiteboards behind him, he's relying a lot on people already being familiar with some of the visual terminology that he uses. I won't go into it here, but when he was talking about taking the element of creation and breaking it down, he was also, I believe, referring to the material that he's written about on the Dirac delta function and its Fourier transform, and I really truly won't go into that. What he was actually saying about physics was not really just because he mentioned the word, but he was contrasting, if in a sense, physicists are basically looking for how does the universe work, what's going on, and taking all of the discrete elements that they observe in experiments and adding them together to see if they form a unity. And they continually have trouble with that, but that's a whole other topic. What he did from the beginning, what Stanley did from the beginning of his research was what he means by going top down is he started with something which by definition is a unity if you kind of accept that path. The letter text, the words of the Torah, starting with what he saw and exploring that to see how it breaks down into the world that we see. Again, back to the thing which I believe, which Michael mentioned in the very beginning of this, this, that Hashem looked into the Torah and that was how creation was made, and created the world. And so Stanley's research basically kind of adopted that perspective to see, okay, what's going to happen. And he was continually finding parallels between that and various different ideas in physical theory, which was something that he had an interest and a background in, really to the end of his life. That he was always thinking of those two things as reflecting each other. And I will go now to somebody else, please.
Well, I remember when I first got involved with his work, I knew nothing about physics. I mean, that was not something I studied much in school. And he was talking about physicists looking for a unified field.
Mhm.
That was the term that was used. And I don't know if that's still the case. And he was making some parallels with that. Less later on, I didn't hear that much later on. And I'd have to go back to the book to see what references are being made were made in the book in that, using that concept that he just described on the video in terms of physicists looking at it from top down rather than bottom up.
But the other way around.
Or I'm sorry, yeah, the other way around.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting thing going on here, which is that, it's very important in physics and experiments to take the person out of the experiment. And that's real, and that's a good thing. But again, I'm nothing against going to Mars. It's a great idea. But when you have a world where millions of people are starving to death, and we're working on going to Mars, something's off, so to the degree that people aren't thought of as important, it's only the externalities are important. And one of the things that's really awesome about what Stan is saying here, and there's so many things here, so many implications, is that, what it's like, you're looking out here and you're trying to find something unified by putting all these different things together, and what does it add up to? Well, what he's pointing out is it already is unified. It's just you can't see it because you're looking in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. And it's a methodology that he's proposing. And one of the kind of frustrating things is that, and maybe this has to do with how our survival over the last several thousand years, is we've been forced to intellectualize many of our teachings. And one of the prime distinctions of Judaism is that it takes, like Michael mentioned in the beginning, it takes the highest concepts and expresses them within the physical world. And I think that what Stan is pointing out is that that's a unified thing. And if we change the way we look at it, we can start to make really amazing strides in the world, as opposed to just step by step, as a really inch by inch, centimeter by centimeter. If you unlock the potential of a human being that was previously starving to death, it could be that human being, for example, understands how to do something, their mind is capable, if they have the right support, of making cold fusion or something else that's really fantastic. Because who knows? But when we waste human potential because we're searching and focusing entirely on externalities, we're missing incredible opportunities that would help the external world tremendously. And this is one of the most beautiful things about Stan's work, is that it's inclusive of all of humanity and of humanity being at the center of things, as opposed to ideas, which is an amazing thing, because he also was filled with wonderful ideas. But yeah.
Great. Okay. All right. Adele, what is your choice? And unmute, please.
I chose Vortex Flame, separating sense from nonsense.
don't be overly impressed. If I had taken a coat hanger and bent it up with a couple of squiggles and played around with my shadows, I'd have found all the letters in just about any alphabet. It is not hard to find shadows of a squiggly form that look like letters. It's hard to find a explicit, meaningful form that does that. And so it's the fact that that's a meaningful form that counts, not just that you can make shadowgrams that make letters.
That was an important point, that it's interesting. If you watch the video called The First Verse, it's that 20-minute video. And it kind of built up to the fact that you could, show different shadows of the letters. I mean, it was very exciting. I put like 3 clips in a row of him talking about that, because it was really, wow, look at this. That's the wow factor that occurred back then. And then this one comes on. But don't be overly impressed. Oh, now he's taking me down after all this excitement, But what he's saying is, yeah, anybody could do this, and it's got to be meaningful. And then after that, we go into the hand model and showing the meaning of it. So, yeah, I mean, that was the integrity of Stan. He could have just gone off with that one idea, but it,
Well, I mean, he was a lot more intellectually demanding than that, and in fact, this is probably the most calm way that he stated, that don't be overly impressed. There was a period of time, again, back in the early to mid 80s, when there was a whole lot of woo-woo going around. And anybody my age will remember what I mean by that word. Just a lot of really baseless ideas and excitement around nothing. And we often had a difficult time in presentations or whatever. People were curious, people were nice, and how do you say gently that, yeah, but that's not the point. Yeah, but that's not the point. And in the ensuing decades, people have become much more skeptical and jaundiced about these woo-woo things that come up, which was always kind of a relief to us, because he didn't have to say that so much. The shape itself is both physiologically meaningful and mathematically meaningful. It's meaningful in that, well, okay, I am not feeling fluent enough today to go through the whole presentation of it, but it's in there in his tapes for sure. And he derived that shape not by bending up a little piece of wire or whatever. In fact, I've got a whole box full of failed models and a whole notebook full of models that worked for 4 or 5 letters and then it broke down. So the fact that this particular shape was both psychologically, physiologically, and mathematically meaningful shape relating to its function, that was the aspect of it that kind of sealed the deal for him. Yeah.
And it's interesting how that shape, I mean, I'm sure it blew him away when he finally got it, and it did represent all the letters. And I guess a lot of it had to do with that ice bucket.
Yeah.
He got at the flea market. We've shown pictures of it, and he was able to put 6 hands around a circular ice bucket.
And making the connection with tefillin, that you wrap this strap around your hand and it's forming letters, and wait a minute, something wrapped around your hand forming letters. And the connection just popped in. What if I did this? What if I put this model on my hand? Can I see letters that way? And the answer was yes. And from there, the idea of homing in on gestures which display the letters to you when you're making a gesture that is connected to the actual meaning of the letter itself. That was a whole other period of exploration, kind of homing in on gestures that did this for him and for many other people, and which lead, then when the work is handed off to other people like Adele, you take these gestures based on the model as the bones of something. This, I think what he meant by having the letter gestures be the key to a universal language wasn't so much that you could gesture words for every idea with these letters. It was more like what Adele has been doing, that there are key concepts, that this unitary structure, in a sense, of the cycle and sequence of the letter gestures are the bones of a way of communicating. You start with that gesture, as Adele was describing earlier, and from that you move to a more fluid expression of the feeling that it actually encompasses. And since Adele is a dancer and a choreographer, that's what she did with it, and that's what she does with it. Daniel's a musician. That's what music is, what he does with it. So I think that's a people who get kind of stopped by the idea of, well, but how can I gesture this to somebody who speaks Swahili and they'll understand? Well, that's not really what he has in mind. I don't know that he ever actually articulated that, but the gesture letters, gesturing those letters of creation, that's the bones of a communication system, which then relies on the person who's doing it and their nature and their experience to communicate in whatever way they have perfected in doing. That's my idea. I just sort of realized that I think that was his idea also, but he never articulated it in quite that way.
Adele, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just remember him saying on more than one occasion in our conversations that he saw a pattern. Like he opened the Torah and said, there's a pattern here. It's the way his mind sees things.
Mm-hmm.
Like I look out at the woods and I see a jumble of leaves and twigs, but he might look at it and see a pattern of the way the sun comes through the leaves. I don't know. The sun's coming onto me now through the window. It's creating a pattern on me as I look at myself. But he said you can see patterns in anything, but is the pattern meaningful? And that's what he always went back to. And when that structure was made and he put it inside the tetrahedron, which is the most symmetrical geometric figure, and put this spiral that's the most asymmetrical inside it, and saw the 7 axes of the tetrahedron and turned it on these axes. I mean, all these experiments were brilliant. But for himself, he said when the letters were seen on the wall with a flame and a shadow, and he saw the letters, it still wasn't the same as the moment when he realized that this little thing fit in his hand. Now he was embodying the letters. Once it was in his body, right, and he could see it out of his eye, and he could wait until that letter was seen to know that that is the right gesture. It was just, I remember asking Lavana and Stan, what was that like, that moment when you realized this thing fits in your hand and turning your hand creates the letters rather than a shadow and turning on axes. It's not the geometric perfection of a tetrahedron. It's
No.
now the human quality of shifting and moving your own body. And that's when, they
Yeah.
tried to explain the excitement. You said he was coming up the stairs with his
I,
eyes
I, I,
all lit
I
up.
remember I had this picture in my mind of, looking at his hand and just this big, big smile on his face. And, he was walking up to show me, and I was like the first person in the whole world to see his moments like that, and I always felt and still do that it was such a great honor and a great privilege. It's like I'm the first person who gets to see these things. That's kind of a personal thing, but it was like I say, I still have the picture in my head. I've never forgotten.
I mean,
you earned it, Lavana, believe me.
I mean, we see the end product and it fits in my hand and I soften my fingers in the shape of it and this is the end, but the number, like you said, of just a collection of geometric shapes that he created that in
Didn't
a
quite
sense
work.
failed. They weren't what he was looking for, but
Yeah.
each one was a process toward this realization and the creativity of seeing that apple shaped water bucket or ice bucket and to see that apple and just suddenly like whoosh, it's all the incremental work that goes before it that allows that creative moment to exist.
Yeah.
Otherwise he would have passed the bucket by. He would have gone to that flea market and never saw the
He was
apple.
already thinking about apples, so it did catch his eye. I don't know why he was thinking about apples, but he was.
Because it's a Taurus and he was
Yeah.
probably already generating some concepts around it. So I really admire the creative process and how what he's given us is raw materials for more creativity.
Yeah, exactly. That
Many,
was
many
remarkable.
forms, in many forms.
something that was very important to him. Yeah.
Okay, Daniel, it's your turn. Let's see what you have chosen for us.
You
Solving Babel.
So that's what we have here. We have a natural, universal gesture language turned into a formal system for recording and playing back meditational exercises, which can become the true basis for a science of consciousness, which in modern terms becomes a religion, or several religions actually. In fact, that's also what this model talks about.
So that's a pretty involved statement, but he did say a couple of times to me, or mention the fact that he believed that Judaism did not start as a religion, that it started as a science of consciousness, and a religion grew from that. So what does that mean to any of you?
Oh. Well, it seems like it hints at something, kind of like a golden age for mankind, you can kind of feel it in that statement, I mean, that's, the John Lennon song Imagine, with no religion. I mean, I'm not sure what he meant by that, but what Stan is saying is actually much more interesting. Stan is almost saying like the core of religiosity, which is consciousness, an exploration of consciousness, an exploration of the inside and of relationships, between people and between people in the world and people and God, is what's really important about religion. And so it's kind of like he seems to be hitting at a time where like the externalities they're just not as important, and the practice of things, and again the relationships, the relational qualities you know, there was a great rabbi in Jerusalem who wrote a book called Pathways of Peace. I met him actually. The Slonim Rebbe, very interesting human. He said there are three relationships in our lives. There's us to ourselves, us to others, and us to God, or between those. And it seems like at the best, religions in general try to make those three relationships more cohesive or more healthy. And religions at their worst seem to contaminate all three of them. And so it seems what Stan is saying or hinting at is this concept of this universal age where we don't need the externalities drop away, and we can actually start to get down to the real work and the real exploration, which is, I think, a very, I don't think we're quite there yet, let's say, but
No
but I think that it's exciting to know that, like, he really got this concept of what I would call a messianic age.
The foundation of that statement that I made before, if you go back to the biblical stories, and the idea that that oneness was the aspect that we were taking on. If you think of, you have to extract these stories, and I'm sure there's a lot of midrash and stories about this, of the high priests and Levites having this exceptional quality or ability based on some of these ideas, that Moshe came down with not only the 10 Commandments, but the Torah, and the Torah being interpreted by the priests and the Kohanim, and the people living by the 10 Commandments, and that's being their moral structure. And so, and then religion comes in, and then we have a lot of things that we have to do and we're, told to do, and a lot of it being fear-based. For many, over the centuries, it was the fear of God, not the love of God, that people lived on and worshipped under. So I think he's really going back to the roots in coming up with these statements, and looking at it. How did this develop from a kernel, from a seed, from Abraham, through the times, through the different stories that we have. And it almost seems like we could reinterpret it, every one of these stories, in just the Torah alone, under that kind of under those kind of eyes, looking at it from that perspective, using the science of consciousness, for example.
Yeah, you have to that's a really short clip, and it's helpful if you understand what he meant by those two terms. When Stanley thought of religion, and this is just him as a person, to him, religion was the kind of thing where you're obligated to do X, Y, and Z, and otherwise you're very passive about it. He was not a person who was terribly into ritual. He didn't like other people telling him what to do. He was an independent thinker who liked to go to the heart of things. And his personal encounters with religion, particularly as we tend to think of it here in America, where it was like, shh, these people are idiots. That was his, his thought processes going, because he was a deep thinker, even as a kid. And that's not generally what you encounter in Sunday school, no matter what religion you're going to Sunday school to learn. And so, but he was very deeply interested in how does what we think and what we feel affect what we perceive and how we live. The kinds of questions that, it's like, how does our consciousness create our reality? And I'm not talking woo-woo stuff. I'm talking things much more subtle than that. And at the very least, you can understand that how we think and feel affects what we notice in the world around us. And that what we notice and take in a sense, is what forms our reality. That's just kind of basic, a way for people to find that the idea of studying how your consciousness works, and also how, if you change your perspective, if you change your framing, then that's a way of deeply affecting your reality. That's just one aspect of what he meant by science of consciousness. And what he's saying is that what is contained within the Torah or the letter sequences, or the deep tradition, amounts to very smart and deep people writing down, discussing, whatever, how does this universe actually work? That and to the extent that that those questions aren't dealt with in a serious way in what we consider to be our current religious practices, temple, synagogue, church, mosque, whatever, that he just had no patience with that.
I love the story. I love the story about when you had a Orthodox rabbi staying with you, and he said, "Look, Stan, if you're going to do this work, you have to follow the tradition." And he said, "Okay, we'll keep kosher. We won't do stuff on Shabbat, but I am not putting on tefillin." That's ridiculous. So he made the rabbi do a video of how to do it. And at some point he said, "Okay, I'll watch the video." I don't know how much longer. And he watches the video, takes the tefillin, wraps it around, and then looks at his hand and sees,
and saw what I was talking about before.
yeah.
Oh, you're supposed to see letters in your hand. Oh.
He did that kicking and screaming. Yeah.
It was over a year. It was a couple years,
Yeah, well, see how it turned out, I mean, Stan was looking for, like a lot of us did growing up in this tradition, we were looking for logic, because a lot of what we were taught earlier in Hebrew school wasn't logical, didn't make sense. If you looked at the Torah, the English translation of the Torah, and you're looking at begat this, begat that, this battle happened here, they killed this, they killed that. This is what our religion is based on, but we didn't know about the letters and what they meant.
or any of the other really, again, deep thinking that was focused
Deep
around.
thinking, that's right. We didn't know anything about Kabbalah, for example. So, okay, yeah, Michael.
I want to call our attention to the fact that we have used words of seeing, how Stan saw this, or sense and nonsense. And we have 5, really 6 senses. We see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. And when we stop for a second and just freeze frame it, and we lock into something that moves us, we tend to kind of push stuff aside and kind of stay with that. And if you see the world, certainly the way Stan saw it, but the way a musician or a choreographer or anyone sees it, we tend to stop and go down that path. It's as if somehow the truth is at the center of a wheel, and all these spokes are coming out, which involved our closing off our senses. And I think that's what religions have done. I think they found along the way, when it became organized, especially after the destruction of the temple, when the early ancient rabbinic figures were together in the destruction of the temple, they needed something that was going to hold on to a truth that was at first given to an agrarian society. I mean, of the 613 commandments that are normally touted, like 200 of them have to do with you're having land that you're working in, on a field. And that land has that sacredness the same way that truth has a sacredness. I was reading something the other day where this very clearly Orthodox rabbi, in his introduction to this book, called himself an observant Jew. Now, most people will say, I'm Orthodox, I'm conservative, I'm Reform, I'm Renewal, I'm Reconstructionist, whatever label it is. But each one of those is a freeze frame kind of system. And he said observant. And I thought to myself as I read it, I like that idea, but I would turn it into a verb, to be an observing Jew, not as an adjective of observant, because even though he didn't put on tefillin at the beginning and of his encounter with this whole crowd, he was an observing Jew, but he was observing it through his eyes. None of us can do that because there's not a physicist among us. Anybody disagreeing? I think everybody goes along with that. Okay. And I can't observe it through Adele's eyes. She said something before, and it triggered my my memory of something as I was looking through. She has a whole piece of choreography based on Dalit. Now, Dalit, one of its prime essences, meanings, is delet. It's a door. It's a doorway to something. It's a doorway to the four worlds, a doorway to, if you're a mystic, you're going to go down that rabbit hole. And it's like, doing a search online, and half an hour later, you came back like 20 subjects away from what you started searching to begin with. And this guy said, this is what I was looking for. He was talking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, a well-known and respected rabbi, who talked about radical amazement. In other words, not who, but wow. It was, what is the wow of it? The same look that Stan had in his face when, no doubt, before he came up the stairs, that he had his own little wow downstairs and then came up with that. And this person said, this idea of a wow is like, he got a meaning. It wasn't that Heschel got it, but that this guy who was talking got it from Jim Morrison. And I went, he's talking about Heschel and Rav Kook, and suddenly he's talking about Jim Morrison, who was from The Doors, who got the name of the band from Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception. And that came from William Blake, who wrote, if the doors of perception were cleaned, like if your glasses were clean and you could really see, hear, feel, then everything would appear to us as it is, infinite. Now, when you put together in a paragraph, Blake, Jim Morrison, Rav Kook, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and choreography based on Stan Tenen, you realize how a freeze frame happens and you pick a word and suddenly a religion is born that has sense, because you're going down that line, and has non-sense. That is to say, we can't even sense it. I'm not talking about what Levana lovingly calls the woo-woo crowd, but it's mind-boggling that he had a way of looking, of sensing. And somebody said to me yesterday, I don't know if it's true, because I know when on Yom Kippur, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, and so the holiest guy on the holiest day in the holiest place said the holiest word and pronounced God's name from the silence that came from the ark. And I thought, wow, and that happened every year. That's a wow. But he said, and I don't know if it's true, Dan, you may know, he said, and when a high priest came to that place and did that, he could only do it once. Well, then that means there was a new high priest every year. That didn't make sense. I'd never heard that. But even if it's true or it's not true, I don't know. But it was the idea of having that. So I began to think, okay, so everybody's a spark of divinity, right? And there's a truth inside us, and we have to find the doorway for that. So we look between the angels and we hear a still small voice. That's supposedly what he experienced at that moment. What was where were those cherubs? They were around an ark. And what's in the ark? The broken tablets and the second set of tablets. That's the tradition anyway, that they were both in there. So we use this idea to think, wow, he's listening to God. But what if we turned it around? What if we weren't looking at the wholeness of that completed set of stones of the Ten Commandments, but the broken set? So it's like talking to each other. A psychologist might take that idea and say, wow, I can build a whole system on the way to listen for the still small voice coming from another human being who has a truth, has the 10 sphirot, but broken inside of him or hidden by veils or stuff, ego, that doesn't allow us to hear. It's like just listening to you talking about senses and the letter Dalet, and like I'm having my own wow just thinking about all this stuff.
Well, you're wowing us out of,
Yeah,
it's brought up about 20 different concepts.
Right, but it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. And
Oh my
I
God.
can understand Stan's frustration when he's talking to somebody, and I'm talking about like big crazy stuff, and he's doing it through the physical. He's coming like from the other direction.
Yeah.
And you need so much information. And doing what Chuang-Tzu said, where can I find a man who's forgotten all the words so I can have a word with him? Somebody who's internalized all these things, as Stan did in his world. And from that truth came the big truths. But every one of us is different. So Adele's truth is going to come out in this amazing reflection of Dalet. And Dan's music is going to come out of the reflection of it's I don't know. I'm just
and
I'm like that little emoji with the guy with the explosions.
yeah. I had a thought, but I lost it.
I'm sorry.
I mean, you just went into a whole different program, a whole new program, I should say,
Yeah.
of discussion. I mean, and unfortunately, we've used up a lot of time. It really went fast today. We really zoomed through this. And I think this is a good basis for discussion. We never know what direction it's going to go from the initial thing, but Stan just saying a few words obviously opens up a whole cache of information. So we'll continue this again next time, but for today we want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.